My parents kicked me out for chasing my dream, so I bought their house and tripled the rent. My name's Travis. I'm 26. I studied marketing in college because it was safe and practical, or at least that's what my parents always said. Bruce and Carol, my parents, had this whole image in their heads about what my life should look like. Go to a respectable university, get a business degree, land a stable job, work my way up, eventually get married, buy a house, pop out a couple of kids, and spend holidays hosting them while pretending to enjoy it all. You know, the usual middle-class American dream checklist. The thing is, it wasn't mine. I'd always had this creative itch I couldn't scratch, ever since I was a kid. While other kids were glued to cartoons, I was rearranging my room for the 5th time or sketching out fantasy blueprints for houses that didn't exist. It wasn't until college that I finally started to realize what that itch was: interior architecture. Not design, exactly, and not full-blown architecture either, but the space between the two. How spaces feel, how they function, how they reflect the people who live in them. I fell in love with it. The problem? Bruce and Carol didn't. When I first brought it up, it was over dinner one weekend I came home. I had done a ton of research. I found programs that would let me shift majors with minimal credit loss, and I even looked at internship opportunities to make up for the switch. I thought they'd be skeptical, maybe a little annoyed. I wasn't expecting them to flip out. Carol put down her fork like I had just said I was joining a cult. Interior what? Travis, don't be ridiculous. You're already halfway through marketing. You want to throw that away for some artsy fantasy? Bruce didn't even look up from his plate. Do you know how many people end up broke chasing that kind of nonsense? You want to be another guy living in a studio apartment eating ramen at 30. It's not nonsense, I said, trying to keep calm. It's a legitimate field. There's demand and I actually enjoy it. I don't want to spend my life in a cubicle selling toothpaste campaigns. Don't be dramatic, Bruce snapped. You're not changing your major. We're not paying for some pipe dream. That was when I said it. The words just came out and I didn't plan them, but once they were out there was no going back. You're not paying for it. I've been covering my tuition with scholarships and my own job since sophomore year. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring. Carol looked stunned, like I'd slapped her. Bruce slowly set his knife and fork down and stood up. You want to be independent, he said quietly. Then be independent. I didn't understand what he meant at first. I thought maybe he was just mad, trying to make a point. But when I got home from work the next day, I walked into the house and saw 2 garbage bags by the door. My stuff. Some clothes, a few books, my laptop charger tangled up in one of the handles. Carol was standing there, arms crossed. You have 48 hours to find somewhere else to stay. I laughed. Literally laughed, because I thought they were joking. But Bruce came out from the garage holding a cardboard box with my name on it. We're not joking, Travis. We gave you every opportunity. You want to blow your life up? Do it somewhere else. That night, I slept in my car. It was late September, not freezing, but cold enough to remind me I had no plan B. I stayed parked behind the campus gym so I could sneak in to use the showers in the morning. I couldn't bring myself to call anyone at first. I was too embarrassed. I wasn't some reckless kid. I had good grades, no criminal record, a decent part-time job. I wasn't even failing marketing. I just wanted something else. By day 2, I caved and called my friend Micah. He lived with 2 other guys in this tiny off-campus apartment. He said I could crash on their couch for a bit if I didn't mind the clutter. I didn't. I would have slept in a broom closet if it meant not spending another night in the car. I ended up staying there for almost 3 months, sleeping on a lumpy futon in the corner of the living room. I got a second job working weekends at a cafe downtown to save for a deposit. I kept going to classes and started filling out applications to transfer. I still wanted to switch to interior architecture, even more now. Every time I looked around that cramped apartment, I imagined how I'd redesign it if it were mine. My parents didn't call. Not once. Carol blocked me on Facebook, and Bruce must have had my number removed from the family group plan because my phone lost service the same week they kicked me out. Eventually, I found a small basement studio about 45 minutes from campus. It was ugly as hell, linoleum floors, flickering fluorescent lights, and a water heater in the corner that groaned like a dying bear, but it was mine. I signed the lease with the last of my savings and bought a futon off Craigslist. That was my bed, my couch, and my everything for a year. Now, almost 2 years later, I'm still in that same studio. But it looks different. I painted the walls, added shelving, swapped out the lights, made it feel like home. And last month, I got accepted into the interior architecture program at a nearby university. I'm starting over next semester. Bruce and Carol? They found out through my aunt. Apparently she follows my Instagram, where I post some of my design sketches and before and after photos of the studio. Last week, out of nowhere, Bruce emailed me. Just one line, "Proud of you. Let us know if you need anything." I haven't responded. I don't even know what I'd say. After that night sleeping in my car behind the campus gym, I called my friend Robbie. He didn't even hesitate. He just said, "Come crash here for a while, man." Robbie lived in this small, two-bedroom apartment he shared with his girlfriend, but he had this old folding bed from when he used to host bandmates. That became my new bed, set up in the corner of the living room beside a window that didn't close all the way. It creaked every time I moved, and the mattress was so thin I could feel the metal bars underneath, but it was a step up from the back seat of my car. At first, I thought I could juggle everything. I told myself this was temporary, just a bump in the road. I still had my part-time job at the bookstore on campus, and I picked up extra shifts wherever I could. Between that and student loans, I scraped together just enough to buy groceries and help Robbie with utilities. He never asked me to pitch in, but I couldn't freeload. That just wasn't in me. But things started to unravel faster than I expected. Without a stable place to study, my grades started slipping. I'd try to concentrate on my homework at night while Robbie and his girlfriend watched TV 10 feet away. I wore noise-canceling headphones and stared at my screen until my eyes blurred, but it didn't help. Every time I opened my laptop, all I could think about was the look on my mom's face when she told me I had 48 hours to leave. The pressure got worse. I was trying to keep up with lectures during the day, shifts at the store in the evenings, and late nights studying on a fold-out bed with no privacy. I started skipping classes just to get a few extra hours of sleep or pick up another shift to buy groceries. I ate once or twice a day, mostly ramen and toast. My weight dropped. My skin broke out. I stopped checking my email because every time I opened it, there was another reminder of how far behind I was falling. The worst part was pretending I was okay. I didn't want to burden Robbie or seem ungrateful. He was doing me a huge favor just by letting me stay. So I smiled, said thanks, and brushed it off whenever he asked if I needed anything. But inside, I was burning out. Fast. 2 months after I moved in, I hit my breaking point. I was sitting in a lecture hall, halfway through a marketing case study I couldn't care less about, and my brain just shut off. I looked around at all the other students, some half asleep, some typing furiously, and I realized I didn't belong there anymore. I wasn't learning. I wasn't growing. I was barely surviving. That night, I went home, opened my laptop, and dropped out. It wasn't some dramatic moment. No tears, no music swelling in the background. Just me on Robbie's folding bed, clicking withdraw on the university's website. Took about 5 minutes. After that, I closed the lid and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not Robbie. Not my friends. Not even the university advisor who had helped me transfer into the marketing program in the first place. I just stopped showing up. Stopped trying. It was the first time in my life I'd ever quit something major, and it felt like both a relief and a failure at the same time. That's where I was. 26 years old, broke, homeless except for the kindness of a friend, and officially out of school. The plan my parents wanted for me? Gone. The plan I wanted for myself? On hold. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't keep going the way I was. Once I officially left school, I knew I had to survive somehow. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have a stable place to live. And I definitely didn't have any savings. So I took whatever jobs I could get. The first one was at a local pizzeria, a small place on the edge of town where the owner was always yelling and the oven made the whole back of the building feel like a sauna. I worked the late shift, mostly cleaning, running orders to the front, restocking supplies. The pay was awful, but it was something. About 2 weeks into that job, I picked up a second one, overnight security at a business center across town. It was one of those bland corporate complexes with motion lights in the hallways and coffee machines that barely worked. My job was to walk the same route every hour, make sure all the doors were locked, and call the police if anything weird happened. Nothing ever did. It was just 10 hours of silence, flickering hallway lights, and trying not to fall asleep on the job. Between the 2 gigs, I barely slept. I'd get off at the pizzeria around 11 at night, bike across town to the business center, work until 7 in the morning, then crash at Robbie's place for a couple of hours before doing it all over again. I lived on gas station energy drinks, instant coffee, and the leftover pizza slices I could sneak home at the end of my shift. My stomach was a wreck, and my body was constantly on edge, but I didn't have the luxury of rest. Everything I owned fit in one backpack. One change of clothes for work, one for sleeping, and a hoodie I wore everywhere because the nights in the business center were freezing. I kept deodorant, toothpaste, and a toothbrush in a plastic bag, and I used the bathroom at the office to clean up as best I could. Some nights I'd nod off in the staff break room with my head on the table and wake up 10 minutes later in a panic, thinking I'd missed my patrol check. My sleep schedule was a mess. 3 hours here, maybe 1 in the afternoon if I had the time, never more than that. But through all of it, I still held on to one thing: design. It was the only thing that kept me from losing my mind. In whatever free time I had, I'd sit in the corner of Robbie's apartment, open my laptop, and study. I taught myself 3D modeling using free trials and YouTube tutorials. I learned the basics of SketchUp, Blender, and a little bit of AutoCAD when I could find cracked versions online. I watched walkthroughs on architectural visualization and tried to replicate what I saw. I had no mentor, no structure, no guidance, just a stubborn need to not let go of the one dream I had left. Some nights after my shift at the business center, I'd stop at a 24-hour cafe, order the cheapest thing on the menu, and sit there with my laptop until they kicked me out. The glow of that screen became the only light in my life that didn't feel like a dead end. I'd sketch layouts on napkins, save images for inspiration, and take notes on anything I didn't understand so I could look it up later. I wasn't making progress anyone else could see, but I was fighting for something, for a chance to rebuild the version of my life I actually wanted. So yeah, that was my life. 2 jobs, no sleep, and all my possessions on my back. But I had my laptop, I had a dream, and I hadn't quit yet. And sometimes when you've got nothing else, that has to be enough. It was just another late shift at the pizzeria. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of tired-looking regulars and a group of college kids sharing a pitcher of soda in the corner. I was on my break, sitting at the small table near the kitchen where the floor tiles never sat quite right. I had 20 minutes before I had to get back to restocking napkins and mopping the floor, so I pulled out my tablet, the only decent piece of tech I owned, and started working on a 3D room layout I'd been messing with for weeks. I wasn't doing anything special, just refining some lighting, adjusting texture detail on the furniture, cleaning up rough edges in a small bedroom render I designed based on the layout of Robbie's apartment. I had my earbuds in and was completely zoned out when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked up, half expecting it to be my boss telling me break was over, but instead, it was one of the customers, a guy maybe in his late 30s, dress shirt rolled up to the elbows, leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder. He pointed at the screen. "That your work?" I nodded, unsure what he was getting at. "Yeah, just something I'm working on." He smiled and leaned a little closer to get a better look. "That's clean. You using Blender?" I blinked. Most people didn't even know what Blender was. "Yeah, mostly. Some SketchUp too, depending on the layout." He asked me to show him a couple of other projects, so I pulled up a few of my renders. The living room mock-up I'd built last month, a small modern kitchen with layered lighting I'd been experimenting on, even one of the early designs that was basically just a rough sketch in 3D space. He stood there watching, asking questions, nodding like he actually knew what he was talking about. Eventually, he looked up and said, "You ever considered doing this professionally?" I laughed under my breath, a little bitter. "That's the dream. Right now I'm just trying to make rent." He introduced himself. His name was Derek, and he worked at a design studio downtown. He didn't say which one, but he gave me his card and said, "We've been looking for a junior assistant. You've got a good eye, and honestly, this is better than a lot of the student portfolios I've seen. You free for an interview this week?" I stared at the card like it was made of gold. I think I nodded too fast because he chuckled and said, "Bring some samples, nothing fancy. Just show them what you showed me." That night I didn't sleep. Not because I had to head straight to my overnight shift at the business center, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. I kept playing the moment over and over again, wondering if it was real or if I'd imagined it out of desperation. 2 days later, I showed up to the interview in the only button-up shirt I owned and jeans that weren't ripped. The studio was nothing like I'd pictured. It wasn't some towering glass building, but a second-floor loft space above a boutique furniture store. The floors were polished concrete, the walls were lined with books, fabric samples and color palettes, and the entire space smelled faintly like espresso and wood polish. I showed them my tablet, walked them through my projects, and answered questions the best I could. At the end of it, the creative director, a woman named Natalie, leaned back in her chair and said, "You've got raw talent. We can teach technique, but we can't teach taste. We'd like to bring you on as a design assistant." That was it. No fanfare, no celebration music. Just a job offer. The first one that had anything to do with what I actually wanted to do with my life. I quit the pizzeria the next day. I kept the security job for a little while longer, just to make sure I could stay afloat. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was starting something. 7 months. That's how long it took me to go from design assistant to a core member of the team. It wasn't overnight, and it definitely wasn't easy, but I threw myself into the work like my life depended on it, because it kind of did. At first, I was just the guy who took measurements, organized swatches, and double-checked blueprints. I made coffee runs, built mock-ups for presentations, and sat in on meetings without saying a word. But I watched everything. I took notes on how the senior designers talked to clients, how they presented concepts, how they broke down feedback without sounding defensive. I asked questions. Not in an annoying way, but just enough to show I cared. My mentor, Lauren, noticed. She was the kind of person who didn't waste time on people who weren't serious, but if she saw potential, she leaned in. After the first couple of months, she started giving me small design elements to work on, color palettes, surface textures, spatial flow suggestions. I stayed late to get it right. I came in early with options ready to go. If she gave me feedback, I applied it that same day. It wasn't long before she started assigning me bigger tasks. One time, she handed me a layout for a client's home office and said, "Make this breathe." I spent an entire weekend reworking it from scratch, adjusting the natural light, redesigning the furniture orientation, softening the acoustics with layered textures. When I presented it to her on Monday, she didn't say much. She just nodded once and said, "Pitch it to the client." I was terrified, but I did it, and they loved it. That was my first successful case. After that, the projects kept coming. Full-time work followed soon after. No more balancing 2 jobs, no more energy drinks just to stay awake through the day. I had a real salary, a real desk, and a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, I belonged here. Lauren started trusting me with client interactions. She'd loop me in during the early planning stages, ask me to take the lead on certain phases, and by the 6th month, she stopped double-checking everything I did. She still gave feedback, but it shifted from corrections to refinement. She'd say, "You're on the right track. Push it further," or "That's good, but what if we went even bolder here?" And I'd take the challenge and run with it. I could feel myself changing, not just the way I worked, but the way I carried myself. I started speaking up in meetings. I started mentoring interns, showing them the basics like Lauren had done for me. I still had a long way to go, but for the first time in my life, I felt like an expert. Not because someone handed me a title, but because I'd earned it, hour by hour, project by project. This was more than a job now. It was the beginning of the career I had always wanted. And I wasn't going to let it go. 3 years after I first got that job as a design assistant, I opened my own interior design studio. It wasn't some flashy launch with balloons or press coverage. It was just me, a small rented office with good light, a couple of second-hand chairs, and a laptop I'd upgraded with savings from the studio job. I registered the business, printed some cards, and started taking on private clients. At first, I only had 2 orders a month. Mostly small residential redesigns, basic consultations, and space planning projects. It wasn't enough to live large, but it was enough to get by, and more importantly, it was mine. I poured myself into the work the same way I had back when I was surviving on energy drinks and 2 hours of sleep. I answered every email within minutes, met every deadline ahead of schedule, and treated every project like it was my last chance to prove myself. I posted before and after shots on social media, built a small website on my own, and asked every satisfied client for referrals. Slowly but steadily, it started to build. By the end of the first year, my client base had grown 10 times. I was fully booked weeks in advance, juggling multiple projects across different parts of the city, and had to bring on a part-time assistant just to keep up with admin work. People started reaching out to me instead of the other way around. Word of mouth carried farther than I ever expected, and soon I had clients who were friends of past clients, even a few small commercial spaces that wanted help making their lobbies feel more welcoming. Every time I stepped into a space I had redesigned and watched the client react, it reminded me why I started in the first place. Around that time, things with Melanie got serious. We had met not long after I started at the studio, and we'd been slowly building something stable and real. She stuck with me through the long hours and late nights, through the stress of launching the business and the constant unpredictability of freelancing. We made it work. And once the studio found its footing and my schedule finally leveled out, we started talking about the future. Not in vague someday terms, but real conversations. Where would we want to live? What kind of space did we see ourselves in? Could we find somewhere that matched both our tastes? We started looking for a house. Nothing extravagant, just something comfortable, with character, somewhere we could both feel at home. Every listing we visited felt like another reminder of how far things had come. 3 years ago, I had everything I owned in a backpack and was crashing on a folding bed in someone else's living room. Now I was building a life I actually wanted, not the one my parents tried to force on me, but one I had carved out on my own, one blueprint at a time. Melanie and I were still deep in our house hunt. Most days we'd scroll through listings during breakfast, sending each other links with little comments like, "too far," or "tiny kitchen," or "looks haunted." One morning, I was sitting at my desk going through new listings in a quiet neighborhood not far from where I grew up, and then I saw it. I froze. There it was, the house. My childhood home. The one Bruce and Carol had kicked me out of with 48 hours' notice. I recognized it instantly. The faded blue shutters. The cracked driveway that Bruce always said he'd fix but never did. The same tiny porch where I had sat, bleeding and stunned, the night they threw me out. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe someone else had a similar-looking place. But no, it was the address burned into my memory. The listing said the house had been rented for the past few years, but the owner now wanted to sell and was pricing it to move quickly, $395,000, which was surprisingly low for that neighborhood. The description mentioned motivated seller, minor cosmetic work needed, and ideal for buyers looking for value. There were a dozen pictures, and it looked mostly the same inside, the same outdated kitchen tiles, the same dull beige walls. I even spotted the old light fixture in the hallway that I had helped my dad install when I was 14. What hit me the hardest was realizing my parents didn't even own it anymore. At some point, they had stopped paying the mortgage or maybe sold it and stayed on as renters. Either way, it was clear they weren't in control of it anymore. And now, someone else was selling it, someone who had no idea the history I had with that house. I didn't hesitate. I called the agent listed and set up a showing under a different name, just in case. I walked through the house 2 days later with Melanie. She didn't know the full story yet, only that I wanted to see it alone first. The minute I stepped inside, memories hit me like a freight train. The kitchen where Carol used to bake pies for show, not for us. The living room where Bruce would sit and critique every career plan I ever had. My old bedroom door, still scratched from when I dragged my desk out during high school. I didn't say much during the showing. I just walked through slowly, absorbing every corner. It didn't feel like home. It didn't even feel personal anymore. It felt like a ghost, a shell full of echoes from a life I'd been forced out of. And for some reason, that made me want it more. I made an offer that afternoon. Full price. No contingencies. Cash. The seller accepted the next morning. Just like that, I bought the house I grew up in. I didn't contact Bruce or Carol. I didn't tell the seller who I was. There was no dramatic confrontation, no phone call to let them know their son now owned the roof over their head. I didn't need that. I just wanted control over something they had once taken from me. I still haven't decided what I'm going to do with the place. But in that moment, signing the paperwork, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Closure. Quiet, clean, and mine. It was about a week after the sale closed. The paperwork was finalized, the deed was in my name, and I had the keys in my pocket. I didn't send a letter or call ahead. I just showed up. I figured after everything that had happened, the least I owed myself was the satisfaction of walking up that driveway on my own terms. I parked a block away, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to approach the house the way I used to, on foot, familiar and slow. When I rang the doorbell, I didn't even know if they'd answer. For all I knew, they might have already heard something through the grapevine. But when the door opened, Bruce was standing there, looking older than I remembered, grayer, and more tired around the eyes. He stared at me for a moment with a blank expression, like he was trying to place my face but couldn't quite get there. "Can I help you?" he asked, almost like I was a stranger. Carol appeared behind him a few seconds later, wiping her hands with a dish towel. She squinted. "Wait, Travis." I nodded. "Hey." Bruce's face went pale. He didn't say anything, just stared. Carol's mouth opened, then closed again. What are you doing here?" "I'm the new owner," I said, holding up the keys. "Just wanted to stop by and meet the tenants." There was a long, heavy silence. I don't think either of them knew what to say. I stepped inside, not asking for permission, and looked around the living room. Same couch, same cheap art on the walls, the same cloying smell of that air freshener Carol always used. "You're joking," Bruce finally said. "You bought the house?" "Paid in full," I replied. "Name's on the deed." Carol looked like she was about to faint. They started asking questions. How? When? Why this house? I didn't bother answering most of them. I wasn't there for explanations. I was there for one reason. "I'm raising the rent," I said. "Effective next month." Bruce blinked, still frozen. "Tripling it, actually," I continued. from $1,200 to $3,600. Carol's hand shot to her chest like she'd just been stabbed. "You can't do that," she gasped. "That's extortion." "No," I said calmly, "it's market value. In fact, you've been underpaying for years. You're lucky the new landlord's being this generous." Bruce stepped forward, his voice low and tight. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said, staring him down. "But I do think it's fair." I left after that. I didn't linger. I didn't gloat. I didn't yell or throw anything or ask why they never reached out. I just walked back out the same door they once threw me through. Only this time, I didn't leave empty-handed. I left with my dignity intact, and the entire house under my name. After I told my parents I was tripling the rent, the mood in that house shifted fast. Bruce went silent, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. Carol started crying, asking me to sit down and talk, but I stood firm. I wasn't there for a discussion. I had already made my decision, and there was nothing they could say that would change it. They started pleading. Carol said they couldn't afford it, that Bruce's pension wasn't enough and she hadn't worked in years. She said the cost of living had gone up and asked if I'd consider keeping the rent the same, or at least increasing it slowly. She even offered to clean the place or take care of the yard, like that would somehow make up the difference. Bruce finally spoke, quieter than I'd ever heard him. "Travis, be reasonable. We're still your parents." That's when I looked at him and said, "You stopped being my parents the day you put my clothes in trash bags and told me I had 48 hours to get out." They had nothing to say to that. I repeated the terms, clearly and calmly. "You can either pay the new rent starting next month, or you can move out. Those are the options. Let me know by the end of the week." Carol begged me again, said they didn't have anywhere else to go. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out the front door, the same one they had shoved me through all those years ago. I got in my car, pulled away from the curb, and didn't look back. At first, I felt victorious. After everything they'd done, the silence, the betrayal, the years of pretending I didn't exist, I was finally in control. I had taken back the house, made them answer for what they did, forced them to face the consequences. They didn't get to throw me out and expect everything to stay the same. They didn't get to treat me like a stranger and still live under my roof like nothing happened. But as the adrenaline faded, so did the high. Sitting in traffic on the way home, I felt this strange kind of emptiness I hadn't expected. I thought it would feel better, more satisfying. But all I felt was distance. We were further apart than ever, and raising the rent didn't bring anything back. It didn't heal the damage. It didn't make them love me. It didn't undo any of it. I wasn't the scared kid they kicked out anymore. I was the man who owned the house. And maybe that mattered on paper. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a clean, cold transaction. One last reminder that whatever we were before, family, connection, trust, was gone.